Yes, thank you very much for the invitation, and I feel honored to be here, and I feel particularly privileged to be able to address you in this very impressive setting. I'm not able to see you, but maybe it's, yeah. The topic I'm talking about today, the multiple dimensional entanglement of restriction on religious diversity, a Myanmar case study, is based on the findings of a 5-year project on religious diversity in Myanmar. From 2015 to 2020, I was frequently in Myanmar and conducted interviews with different religious actors in several regions. In the final analysis, I had over 100 interviews with Buddhist, Christian, and Muslim religious leaders and political activists. I also visited and lived in several religious communities there. The key issue of this research was to find out how Buddhist, Christian, and Muslims deal with religious diversity. The focus was on the following questions. How is plurality perceived and dealt with in religious field itself? And in what way do social and political constellations, as well as cultural influences and historical patterns, shape how religions react to processes of pluralization and plurality? My talk today is divided in 3 parts. I will begin with a brief introduction to the challenges of religious diversity. If religions are instrumentalized, give an overview of ethnic and religious landscape, and outline the political situation. Then I will look in detail at the boundaries and obstacles to religious plurality and entanglement at political, social, and individual level. And with a bit of luck, this will take 45 minutes. I'm not quite sure yet. Let's start with some theoretical considerations on the perception of religious diversity. Religions have developed different conceptions of the right or good order of religious plurality. Even within religious communities, various ideas compete on how to construe religious diversity. Theologically, the multiplicity of religious systems and worldviews was and is perceived as a challenge. A theoretical distinction is usually made as to whether religious communities express exclusive truth claims towards other religions and their ideas of salvation, and only reluctantly concede them a right to exist, or whether they tend towards an inclusivist appropriation of religious competition and tolerate other ideas and practices merely as alternative expressions of the nevertheless one truth. Or, at last, whether they recognize different truth claims and value them for their own search for truth. In Myanmar, Buddhists always refer to a peaceful and harmonious coexistence of religious traditions. Buddhist monks rarely use the words like tolerance or acceptance when they talk about other religions. They speak of coexistence that is peaceful and harmonious as long as the believers are indifferent to the other religions. Religious plurality does not pose a challenge here because Buddhist monks have no interest in other religions and have hardly any contacts. This raises the question of conditions and context that causes religious plurality to be regarded as a problem and a source of conflict. Besides exclusive claims to truth or superiority, one such condition is the instrumentalization of religion. Religious conflicts are predetermined if, first, certain religious traditions are used as central elements of political ambition and are claimed as an exclusive resource of political and natural culture. Third, 2 point. Or if there are attempts to unify identities and political polity. With regard to Myanmar, religion is instrumentalized in the following ways. So Buddhism, especially Buddhism, is instrumentalized to legitimize political hegemony. This has a long historical tradition in Theravada Buddhism and can be traced back to the origins of Buddhism and the interrelation between Buddhist monks and kings. Buddhism is also used as a political tool to force national unity. This so-called Burmanization implies the extinction of ethnic and religious diversity through the propagation of the culture of the Buddhist majority, the Burma. In addition to the enforced national unity, Buddhism is instrumentalized to exclude other ethnic groups through withdrawal of citizenship and deprivation of nationality. The democratization process encouraged religious minorities to practice their faith more openly. They became more publicly visible. The political reactions regarding the participation of religious minorities in the public sphere contributed significantly to the growing perception of diversity as a problem and cause of conflict. For this reason, I will primarily focus on outlining the religio-political context in Myanmar. As a majority Theravada Buddhist country, with a distinct ethnic and religious plurality and vast regional diversity, Myanmar offers many insights into the challenges of religious diversity. The coping with religious diversity is characterized by shifting ethnic religious identity constellations, the local difference of majority and minority relations, and the religious policy of the respective governments. The religious and ethnic identity configurations are a crucial factor in Myanmar's religious policy. There is no collective sense of national identity among the population. Ethnic and religious minorities have no sense of belonging to a nation. Instead, religious and ethnic identities supersede their identities as citizens of Myanmar. But why is it though? First of all, the name Myanmar itself is a source of controversy. Many ethnic minorities believe that Myanmar is just another term for, that actually means Burma, a name that derives from the Burma ethnic group. Many Burma in the government system do not see themselves as one of many ethnic groups. Instead, they see themselves as the owner or host of the country and everyone else as migrants and guests. The Burmanization policy of the former military junta divided majority and minority groups for many decades. Due to the junta's divisive tactic and lack of quality education, many civilian Burma have been unaware of the struggles of the minorities. Of Myanmar's 14 provinces and states, 7 states are named after ethnic groups. Further complicating matters for other ethnic groups who do not belong to the main ethnic groups. They too are sometimes perceived only as migrants or guests in the ethnic states. The country's constitution declares that all citizens are to be treated equally and that there is religious freedom or freedom of belief. In practice, however, ethnic and religious minorities have great difficulty in finding employment in government institutions. The religious freedom of minorities is severely restricted throughout the country. The systematic oppression of ethnic and religious minorities has led to armed conflicts between Shan, Kachin, and Karen ethnic groups and the growth of the significance of ethnic identities in recent decades. Identity politics is pursued equally by the central government and the minorities. Regional and local differentiation of majority and minority relations is another issue that shapes the way religious diversity is approached. In regions with basically one main religion, religious diversity is hardly an issue, but ethnicity is, like in Chin state and western part of Myanmar. 85% are Christians and belong to the ethnic Chin. Being a Christian is intrinsically linked to ethnicity. Another examples are the Karen in southeastern Karen state. They are Christians and Buddhists. Their approach to religious diversity is influenced by post-colonial struggles over an unified Christian Karen identity. Another crucial factor is the religious policy of the government. The democratization process from 2011 to 2021 was openly dominated by an aggressive anti-Muslim policy. Social discourses of danger and pejorative attitudes toward Muslims strengthened the perception of religious diversity as a potential threat. Let's now proceed with a short overview of the ethnic and religious field in Myanmar. With the census, with the 1983 census, the military government did introduce a new scheme for categorizing ethnicity, a list of 135 ethnic groups. How the government came up with this number is a bit of a mystery. One argument suggests that they adopted a number from the 1983 British census, which lists 135 languages. Since then, Myanmar has this 135 officially recognized ethnic groups. These ethnic groups are organized within 8 main groups. The Bama, who make up the majority of the population and are mainly Buddhist. The Mon, Rakhine and Shan, who are also mainly Buddhist. The Karen and Kaya, who are Buddhist and Christian. And the Christian ethnic groups, the Kachin and Chin. Exact percentages are still not accessible. They were not published with the last census conducted in 2014. It becomes clear once again that ethnicity and religion are strongly linked. Just as the Chin has to be a Christian, to be a Bama is to be a Buddhist. However, this also means that a Bama or a Christian cannot belong to another religion. What this explicitly means for the Muslim community and understanding of religious diversity will be discussed later. According to the census, Buddhists are also the majority with approximately 87%. The largest minority are Christian with 6% and Muslim with 4%. Hindus and animists are below 1%. The census also shows that the number of Buddhists is slightly decreased and the number of Christian increases. Nevertheless, the figures should be treated with caution, as communities such as the Rohingya and whole regions were excluded from the census. This affects about 1.2 million people. Therefore, it is assumed that the percentage of Muslims is much higher. What I have not yet talked about is the intra-religious diversity. There is a large number of Christian denominations. Protestant, especially Baptist, constitute the majority here. The Muslim community is equally diverse. Sunnis are the majority, with a larger Shia community in Yangon and Sufi community in Mandalay. There is also a close link between religion and ethnicity among Muslims. The name Burman Muslim, still in use in 1941, is the preferred name of many Burmese Muslims. Also, this is no longer acknowledged. The Buddhist monk community distinguishes 9 Nikaya. However, this does not imply any dogmatic differences, but is an expression of a small variation in monastic rules. I will now sketch the political situation very shortly in Myanmar. On the 1st of February 2021, Myanmar has returned to a military dictatorship with a coup by the military. The period of democratization lasted, you can say 10 years, and Myanmar has been ruled by the military since 1962. As early as the 1950s, the military expanded its position of political power. After a few brief power grabs, the military leadership around General Ne Win, Myanmar's first dictator, finally seized power in the 60s. The military developed a self-image that still shapes and drives them today, being the preserver and savior of the nation, the one legitimate ruler. From 1962 to 2010, the military dominated politics in Myanmar. This long period was marked by stages of direct military rule, with a junta or seemingly civilian government, but institution run by the military, as well as stages of indirect military rule with power to influence political decision-making processes through military veto rights. The generals always succeeded in establishing new strategies to legitimize the decades of their rule. I now move to the next topic, the boundaries, obstacles, and restrictions on religious diversity and their entanglements at political, social, and individual level. Let's start by focusing on the political dimensions. By political dimensions, I mean in particular the state and political regulation of religion, and thereby also the regulation of religious diversity. State regulations of religious diversity take place through constitutions, ministries, institutions, and organizations. I will introduce the Constitution of 2008 and its amendments of 2015. Regarding the ministries, the emphasis is on the Ministry of Religious Affairs and the Ministry of Immigration and Population. Important institutions governing plurality are the Mahanayaka Sangha Council, which regulates Buddhist plurality, and state-sponsored interfaith dialogue groups who are active since 2011. One of the most influential organizations is Mabata, an extremist Buddhist movement that supports the pro-military political party and is a catalyst for hatred and conflicts between religious communities. I will now turn to the current Constitution of 2008, the Constitutional Amendment of 2015, and the Penal Code, to show how religious diversity is governed and restricted by the state. The Myanmar Constitution of 2008 promotes religious freedom with a special position for Buddhism as the faith professed by the great majority of the citizens, and recognizes Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, and animism as the religions existing in the Union. While it is also written in the Constitution that the Union may assist and protect the religions it recognizes to its utmost, it is obvious by the government's activities that Theravada Buddhism is favored. The state is, for example, supporting Buddhism through donations to monasteries and pagodas, the encouragement of education at Buddhist monastic schools, and the support of Buddhist missionary activities. Furthermore, according to the Constitution, every citizen is equally entitled to freely profess and practice religion, as long as it is not contrary to the laws enacted for the Union security, prevalence, and of law and order, community peace and tranquility, or public order and morality. Therefore, the government can as well restrict religious freedom by enacting laws for the purpose of public welfare and reform. And the government has done so in 2015 with the passing of a set of laws called Law for Protection of Race and Religion. These laws were originally introduced by national Buddhist monks in 2013 and deal with interfaith marriage, religious conversion, population control, and polygamy. I would like to take a closer look at two of these four laws that show particularly well how religious diversity is constrained. The Myanmar Buddhist Women's Special Marriage Act regulates the marriages of Buddhist women to non-Buddhist men to the requirement of permission from local authorities. The religious conversion law requires that a Myanmar citizen who wishes to change his or her religion must obtain approval from a newly established registration board of religious conversion set up in townships. The person must also undergo an interview and engage in religious study for a period of 90 to 180 days. If after that period the applicant still wishes to convert, the registration board will issue a certificate of religious conversion. Finally, I would like to take a look at the so-called blasphemy laws. Several provisions in the Penal Code criminalize blasphemy. The laws are often used to prosecute and penalize criticism of religion, especially criticism toward Buddhism. The most used two provisions are Section 295, which state that deliberate and malicious intention of outraging the religious feelings or insults or attempts to insult religion or the religious beliefs will be punished with imprisonment up to 2 years. Another section criminalizes the deliberate intention of wounding religious feelings of any person. The convict is sentenced to 1 year in prison. The sections have been used frequently to prosecute religious minorities and individuals that speak out against extremism, especially Buddhist extremism. Introduced during colonial rule, the blasphemy laws are loosely and rarely formulated and leave them open to subjective interpretation and misuse. The consequences of the legislation are that the state's promotion of Buddhism does not give space to other religious minorities at all. They are tolerated as long as it is not decided by the government that their behavior is contrary to the welfare of the Union. The Ministry of Religious Affairs is responsible for organizing religious practice, and the Ministry of Immigration and Population has the power to grant recognition of ethnic groups. Even if the Ministry of Religious Affairs is in charge of all religious communities, it mostly manages Buddhist affairs and is basically responsible for the promotion and propagation of the sasana. However, it is also in charge of other religious communities. Its responsibilities include the control of religious institutions, religious educational institutions such as Buddhist university, and primarily the control of religious practice, especially through the mandatory registration for gatherings. But due to the focus on Buddhism, other religious communities are at a disadvantage. Their concerns are hardly addressed. The Ministry of Immigration and Population controls religious diversity through the limitation of ethnicity and the control of citizenship. To obtain citizenship, it is important to belong to a subgroup of the recognized 8 ethnic groups I mentioned before. If people do not belong to the specified ethnic groups, they must prove that the ethnic group which they claim to belong to was indigenous to one of the regions before 1823. This is the problem for the Rohingya, who are no longer recognized as an ethnic group and are trying to prove that they were already residents in Myanmar before the British. Those who do not have full or associate citizenship do not have the rights of citizens, such as religious freedom. People are excluded from the national educational system, have no freedom to travel, and are not allowed to own anything. You are effectively stateless. Important is that the citizenship cards state the holder's ethnicity and religion. As I mentioned before, as the entanglements of religion and ethnicity have resulted in the notion that the Burma is exclusively Buddhist, it is, for instance, impossible for a Muslim to be a Burma. These categories are also used by the Ministry of Immigration to decide which ethnicity may appear on your citizenship card. So if you are a Muslim and you want to apply for a new ID card, you cannot be a Burma or a Shan ethnicity, for example. The fixed ethnic categories for Muslims are Indian, Pakistani, or Bengali. So it doesn't matter, actually, if you belong to that ethnicity. In that case, religion dictates which ethnic group you have to belong to. The consequences of the ministry's policies are an alienation of religious minorities, especially Muslims, and a severe interference with religious practice. Building permits for the construction or renovation of temples, mosques, or churches are usually only granted after several years of tough negotiations, and even the permits are often not generally recognized, with the result that construction procedures are delayed or not processed at all, or only with the help of bribes. Religious services or the call for Friday prayers have to be repeatedly registered with the respective municipal authorities. Besides the Ministry of Religious Affairs, there are other institutions, another institution that is supposed to monitor Buddhist monks. The State Sangha Mahanayaka Committee was founded in 1980 with the aim of purification and propagation of Buddhism. 47 elderly monks, affirmed by the Ministry of Religious Affairs, control Buddhist teachings and practices. The control can declare groups illegal. If they do, the council can declare groups illegal if they do not follow the government's definition of orthodoxy. The council has powers to seize monastic property, to disrobe monks, to expel monks from the Sangha, and to sentence them to imprisonment. It broadly sets the Vinaya rules, the code of behavior for monks. It is a body through which the military can confine intra-religious diversity, determine what a Buddhist monk is and who is not, and exercise political control over the Sangha. The state-organized interreligious dialogue has been established since 2012 and can be found at all levels of state administration. It has the function of nothing more than crisis management. A group of selected religious leaders is called together in times of tension between religious groups to maintain peaceful coexistence. However, there is no interreligious exchange happening at this level. There is no interest in understanding the religious other. Used by the government, they tend to further project stereotypes and prejudice. They stand for the view that religious diversity is a problem that causes conflicts and needs to be controlled. The consequences of these policies are state control over Buddhism, and it ensures alliance to the military. Even now, high-ranking monks support the military, whereas at the state level, interfaith groups are a tool of mutual control. The encounters are characterized by mistrust and disinterest. It is an instrument that mediates conflict but perpetuates roles and does not promote understanding between the religions. Now I come to the last point of political regulations of religion by using extremist organizations. The Buddhist organization Mabata, Association for the Protection of Race and Religion, is supported by the military. The organization was renamed Buddha Dhamma Paharita Foundation in 2017. Nevertheless, it became best known under the name Mabata. And it was founded in 2012 by Buddhist monks. Mabata itself states that its purpose is to protect Burmese and the Burmese nation from threats within and outside of Burma. The most important threat is posed by Islam, which is described as contrary to Burmese values. According to the movement's narrative, Islam is inherently violent and driven by an agenda to take over the country, region and globe. Mabata is primarily responsible for the riots against Muslims and anti-Muslim violence that began in 2012. Its religious leaders are very active through social media, inciting hatred with false accusations and fake reports. The sentiments against Muslims stirred up by Mabata has repercussions on other religious communities. The anti-Muslim discourse of Buddhist extremists shaped the social image of Muslims until the coup. To summarize in some sentence in the last minutes, the state clearly gives preference to Buddhism. And even if Buddhism is not a state religion, but it is promoted, it means that Buddhist monks are more visible in public than other religious communities. Nevertheless, the military government has created institutes to control Buddhist monks and keep them out of politics. One reason for this is the social influence of the Sangha. In the past, Buddhist monks headed and supported demonstrations and revolts against the military regime. The Buddhist heritage and linkage between politics and Buddhism allows the military to instrumentalize Buddhism for its own purposes and to legitimize its rule. Restrictions on religious freedom in Myanmar primarily affect Christians and Muslims. This is clearly evident in the inability to build appropriate structures for worship. It is important to take into account that actions by state or non-state actors against non-Buddhist communities are often a result from a combination of restrictions on religious freedom and rejection of the ethnic background of the religious members. The anti-Muslim discourse promoted by Buddhist extremists did not just start with the 2012 anti-Muslim riots. And anti-India and anti-Muslim riots have been going on already prior to independence, mostly additionally stroked up by the military. A new development is that the anti-Muslim discourse is overshadowing many discourses on religiosity. Furthermore, the marginalization of Muslim communities has increased as other religious minorities have become more distanced. The social and individual dimension are difficult to distinguish from the political, as all dimensions are interwoven. What I want to look at in detail are the general social discourses that shape the individual cohabitation of religious communities. The interviews have shown that there is basically no perception of an encompassing state of religious diversity. Individually, religious diversity is assessed in terms of moral boundaries that influence people's life in the neighborhood. However, this takes place less through knowledge of other religions, but rather through personal perception about how others are integrated into neighborhood structures. Thus, from a Christian perspective, a Buddhist is ostensibly a good neighbor or friend if he or she is committed to the social community and is a Buddhist only in the second ascription. But the extent to which experience with other religious communities can be obtained at all depends very much on the region. In large parts of the country, religious communities live separately from each other in their own districts and residential areas. There is hardly any contact. Therefore, it's difficult to speak of experiences. Rather, they live side by side without any interest in other communities. The perception of religious plurality is very much dependent on the contact opportunities offered by living structures. In addition, the regional majority and minority relations also play a role. Another point that influences the awareness of the religious other is the social discourse that is spread via social media. Especially in regions of religious and ethnic demarcation, attitudes towards religious diversity and the religious other is decisively influenced by discourses conveyed through social media, especially discourses on Islam. At this point, I would like to emphasize that with the political opening up of the country in 2011, Myanmar became widely digitalized. With a very short time, social media, especially Facebook, became the #1 communication tool. The large supply of cheap SIM cards and smartphones made it possible for everyone to be part of the digitalization process, with all the advantages and disadvantages. As a result, all kinds of news are now reaching all regions. Groups like Mapatan know how to use this in order to spread their hate messages. Events and social changes thus unfold their everyday relevance for the average citizen through the increasing medialization of society. Medialization is so profound that it redefines at the individual sphere of experience. Whereas until now it was understood as personal and regional face-to-face context through family, friends, neighborhood, this is changing dramatically. The new medialization of the everyday world, however, removes territorial geographical limitation of the individual sphere of experience. The interviews have shown that social media discourses, which are usually transmitted several times a day via smartphones, have a stronger influence on attitudes towards religious others than occasional face-to-face encounters, which take place, for example, in interreligious dialogues. The image that is communicated via social media is that of various threat scenarios, especially the threat to cultural heritage. As I have shown before, the threat for ethnic and religious minorities is Burmanization, whereas the extremist Buddhist, it is Islamization. Due to the threat, ethnic minorities focus more on their own cultural heritage and distinguish themselves from others. Christian minorities emphasize the protection of their own ethnicity, language, culture, and historiography. Their main struggle is not to be assimilated by the majority culture of the Burma. The circulation of threat scenarios through social media channels also provokes interreligious tensions, as the anti-Muslim discourse paints a picture of the absolute foreignness of Islam. The fact that Muslims are visible in particular is particularly problematized in comparison to other religious minorities. This leads to arguments within Muslim communities about what constitutes traditional Islam and what it takes to integrate into Burmese society. Ultimately, it is a discussion about how to become more invisible in order to avoid hostility. The opening of the country and the gradual democratization process strengthened the hope of religious minorities to be able to practice their religion freely, to be empowered to participate in the public sphere. However, the atmosphere was different before the 2020 parliamentary elections. In 2015, religious minorities mainly described the oppression their religious community experienced during the military period. In their narratives, the oppression of religious practice was portrayed as an experience that united all minorities. This changed later. Religious minorities increasingly separated themselves from each other in their narratives of oppression. Newly added was the element of betrayal by the government and insecurity towards other religious minorities. New images of the enemy emerged, which were not yet as clearly defined as they had been during the military era. To conclude, religious diversity in Myanmar is highly problematized, and there are political attempts to limit it. Religious communities perceive religious diversity differently depending on the region and the majority-minority situation. However, the term coexistence is usually used. The perception of religious diversity in the Buddhist community is that of a peaceful coexistence of religion made possible by Buddhist values alone. There is no interest in religious others. The term tolerance is usually only used in the context of interreligious dialogue work. There is no appreciation of the religious other. Civilians and military government policies, as well as the spread of anti-Muslim discourse, have led to increased mistrust among religious communities. Thank you for your attention.